Welcome to all our speakers. I will introduce them to you shortly. We are 1 week away from the election. Election day is November 3rd. But as we're going to learn today, the important date is the Electoral College voting day. And that turns out to be, as I understand it, and I think Gerardo and others will explain this to us, December 14th is when the Electoral College electors meet in their states and DC to actually cast their votes. And then on January 6th, 2021, in a joint session of Congress, they will meet to count up the Electoral College votes and determine the president and the vice president of the United States. So those are important dates as we're about to learn. And before I begin, I just want to remind everybody that Virginia has 33 Electoral College votes. Maryland has 10 Electoral College votes. DC has 3. As compared to California, which has 55. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our speakers. As you have all heard, we're going to have somebody from the Brennan Center talk about the legal underpinnings of the Electoral College and how the states actually cast their votes. Common Cause speaker will tell us about the National Popular Vote Compact and how that would provide more emphasis on the popular vote. And Ronnie Pawelko from the Alliance for Justice will discuss concerns related to the rules of being a 501c3 and C4 organization. I'm going to begin, and Pam Wilmot is the speaker and vice president of state operations for Common Cause. But let me start with Gerardo. Professor Gerardo, well, you used to be professor. Gerardo Vildostegui, did I do that right?
Yeah, Vildostegui or Vildostegui is, but that was great.
Vildostegui. Thank you very much. He's a voting rights advisor at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law. The Brennan Center is named after Justice Brennan, one of my favorite justices, is a policy and advocacy organization for constitutional democracy in the United States. Before starting work at the center, Gerardo taught constitutional law for 12 years at Rutgers Law School and at the New York Law School. He's a graduate of Yale Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal and holds a BA in philosophy from Yale College. I'm turning it over to you, Gerardo. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Jeanette, and thanks also to Sue and to Connie and Sherry and all our hosts at the Clearinghouse. Yeah, it's really an honor to be here, and I'm excited to provide some background about the Electoral College. I would add only to your introduction of the Brennan Center the important qualification that we're a nonpartisan law and policy institute, and our research, our advocacy, and our sort of public educational work in the areas of voting and democracy is, in favor of those ideals and not any particular political side. So when it comes to the topic of the Electoral College, the content of my talk is, of course, influenced by the timing of it. We are, as Jeanette was saying, just 1 week away from the election. In fact, I think 1 week and 6 hours from now, the first polls are going to close in Indiana and Kentucky. And so, given the timing, I think this, and also given the lineup of our speakers, my talk will have a more sort of practical bent. Although, the topic of the Electoral College, if I were talking about it in a non-election year, in a less tumultuous moment, is so fascinating in so many ways. There's a fair amount of history and constitutional law and democratic theory that comes into it. And I'd like to at least give you all a sense of those larger contextualizing questions. And of course, I want to invite you to check out the Brennan Center's website, or even contact me personally if you want to follow up on any of those sort of more arcane corners of the topic. I will say also at the outset that even if you're a very informed citizen, an informed voter, you've participated in many presidential elections as a voter and activist, there may still be a lot about the Electoral College that surprises you. And the larger legal context that supports that institution is extremely complex. As I was putting together my remarks, it occurred to me that you could do an entire semester really of a law school course about the constitutional law, the federal law, the state law, and then the traditions that create the institution. So that even if you're very familiar with how it works, that you go and you vote for president, you really vote for the electors. As Jeanette said, they meet on December 14th in their states. Congress counts the votes on the 6th. You could know all of that and have been a keen observer of it your whole life and still be surprised by a lot of the context. So anyway, I said I would start with the practical effects, and let me just begin there. I think the most important thing to know about the Electoral College, and the most important thing to say about it up front, is that it can produce outcomes that are different from those that a nationwide, direct, popular election of the president would produce. And that has happened 5 times in our history. We've had, I think, 58 presidential elections, and in 5 of those, the Electoral College has produced a result that would be different from what you would get if you just tallied up the votes. Now, the first 3 times that happened all fell in the 19th century. It was 1824, 1876, and 1888. And then for all the elections that began with, 19, this didn't happen again. So if your political coming of age happened during those 100 years, as mine did, you might have just formed the idea that the Electoral College was this kind of largely ceremonial thing that maybe skewed campaigning a little bit, but really didn't matter, and it was more of a relic than anything else. And then the 2000 election happened, and that was the 4th time that the Electoral College has produced, you might say, a wayward result. And then the 2016 election happened. And so for reasons that really a political scientist might be able to explain better than I can, it seems that we are in an era where the Electoral College can produce these strange outcomes. I don't know if you're all familiar with the Princeton neuroscientist Sam Wang. He runs, I think, a website for the Princeton Election Consortium. He estimates that if there's an election where the popular vote is within a margin of 3%, the chances that the Electoral College will produce a winner other than the popular vote comes out to about 1 in 3. So in close elections, particularly in this polarized time we live in, the possibility for the Electoral College to produce a wayward result is much higher than it has been, during the 1900s. Just to illustrate that, what's on sort of at stake for the current election, as of this morning, I checked 538.com, as I'm sure many of you do. They estimate Donald Trump's chances of winning the popular vote at 3%, but they put his chances of winning the Electoral College at 12%. So it's a very significant, you might say, inflation of his chances due to this institutional structure. But of course, elections aren't just about outcomes. The Electoral College affects us in many other ways besides that. And I think the most striking phenomenon for us as voters and as advocates is the phenomenon of the battleground state. As much as the whole nation is energized right now it's a very striking fact that campaigning is happening primarily in 6 to 12 states where the winner is not yet clear. And that, it affects campaigning, it affects public policy in a number of ways. I mean, you might have noticed that in the news recently, California's request for emergency funds to deal with wildfires was originally turned down by the Trump administration. Then there was a reversal on that. And a lot of commentators speculate that the president is less responsive to California because its electoral votes are in a way predetermined for his opponent. So the Electoral College has these very sort of distorting effects. That's what I want to put in the foreground, but I also want to provide a kind of a legal and historical background for you. So let me turn to that briefly. One thing I should note is that the phrase Electoral College, that term, it doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. The college part is something that commentators have added, and it's also a bit of a misnomer because the electors don't all meet together in one place at any time. What they do is meet in their respective states, as Jeanette said, and their authority to do that is set up by Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. And it's a pretty bare bones provision. I'll just sort of read the operative language for you. It says that every state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature may direct a number of electors that ends up being equal to their number of senators plus their number of representatives. The 23rd Amendment modifies that somewhat by giving 3 electoral votes to the District of Columbia. That's all there is in the Constitution. That phrase, in such manner as the legislature may direct, opens up the field for a lot of things. And so I said earlier that you can be a lifelong voter and activist and understand the system well, and not realize that actually, even though the Electoral College is in the Constitution, the particular way we vote now, where we go to the polls, we vote for an elector, there's a winner-take-all system in most of the states except for Maine and Nebraska. All of that is a creature of state law for the most part that determines how the state affords its electors. And that's, that's the reason why, if you're a very close watcher of the election, you might know that Maine and Nebraska, through their legislatures, have chosen to apportion their electoral votes in a somewhat quirky way, giving congressional districts a say apart from the state total. But more than that, the popular voting for president that we do when any one of us goes to the polls is not guaranteed by the Constitution. That's a more recent creature of state law that the states use to determine their electors. And importantly, I know that Pam's talk is going to be about reforms to the system. It's that space that's created for state legislatures that opens up the possibility of something like the National Popular Vote Compact. So really everything we have is kind of cobbled together by the states under the sort of umbrella mandate of Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. I feel like there are many other topics I would love to explore, but I think that important framing sets the stage not only for Pam's remarks about the Popular Vote Compact, but for Ronnie's about our activism and our voting in the year of an election. So there's a lot more that I would love to talk about, and I'm looking forward to, I hope, a question and answer and discussion. But let me turn the floor over for now, and we'll hopefully pick up some of these questions later.
I would thank you. We will have a question and answer session and look forward to that again. You had mentioned the National Popular Vote Compact. It is so interesting, and Pam Wilmot will describe that for us. She is Vice President of State Operations for Common Cause. She oversees a nationwide network of 30 state offices and advisory boards. She was a long-standing Massachusetts Common Cause Executive Director. She's an expert on electoral college, campaign finances, ethics, elections, and transparency laws. She also is the director of the National Popular Vote Initiative to ensure the winner of the popular vote receives 270 electoral votes, which is required to become president, through the National Popular Vote Compact. Pam has a Juris Doctorate from Northeastern University, a master's in social work from Smith College, and a bachelor's degree from Brown University. She received the John Gardner Public Service Award in 2017, and I'm very happy to turn this over to Pam.
Thanks, Jeanette, and thanks everyone. Really timely, fascinating subject. I would add that in 2011, when we had a very large donor, not to Common Cause, but to the National Popular Vote Initiative itself, I went to 16 different state legislatures and lobbied on National Popular Vote. And at that time, it was very popular, even amongst Republicans. And in fact, no subject has been subject to more constitutional amendment legislation than the Electoral College. We came very close to abolishing it in the Nixon years. It passed by 3/4 in the House and fell a couple of votes shy of the 67 required in the US Senate. But back in 2011, before the Donald Trump election, Republicans also thought this was a great idea. And polling has been done for about 50 years by the Gallup organization. And the numbers bump along, but they were very high during that period, including amongst Republicans. It had about the high 50s support on the Republican side and high 70s, 80s amongst Democrats. Now, after the Donald Trump election, we saw the numbers amongst Republicans falling down to the 30s. And the numbers on the Democrats going up until the high 80s in some places, or at least in the 80% range. So like many things, this issue has become very polarized. But in 2011, the states that we visited, Utah, Oklahoma, which actually passed National Popular Vote in its Senate, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, all of these small Western states that are just as ignored in the current system as California and Texas and New York are, thought this was a great idea because unlike our history teaches us, and Gerardo already mentioned, the Electoral College really doesn't help small states. It helps battleground states, those 6 or so swing states that get all the visits and all the attentions. And politicians understand this calculus. They want to be relevant. One thing you meant and that Gerardo mentioned was the California situation with disaster declaration being ignored. This is nothing new. There's a BU professor that actually did a study and found that disaster declarations for similar occurrences were twice as likely in battleground states and got twice as much money. It has implications a long way. Now, I can share a little PowerPoint if you want, or I can just talk you through how a reform would work. Talk or slides? Oh, what's Mary? What are you saying, Mary? I can't hear.
I think We'll leave it up to you. What do you feel like doing?
Slides, I hear. All right.
Okay.
Somebody has to enable me though. I got it. Okay. So we have already covered some of these systems. We talked about how the system currently works. The Constitution gives the states a number of electors equal to the number of congressmen and senators together. That is the only thing that's in the Constitution. As Gerardo said, the state laws determine how those electors are selected, and the states, according to the US Supreme Court, have plenary complete authority of deciding how to do that. And in fact, there is no constitutional requirement for an election at all. My own home state of Massachusetts has changed the way we've awarded electors 11 different times, the final one endorsing the National Popular Vote Compact. But it did not settle on winner take all, and not all states settled on winner take all until quite late in the game. Massachusetts at times had elections, at times said no elections, we, the legislature, are going to pick. And even today, Maine and Nebraska use the congressional district system to allocate their electors. And that means if you win a congressional district, your candidate gets, or the candidate gets, one electoral vote. And then the winner of the state gets the bonus 2 for the for the state. So they have only split once each, and maybe we'll see that again this time in Maine. Who knows? Maine did split the last time Donald Trump got one elector out of Maine, and Nebraska split over in the first Obama election and gave one elector to Obama. Otherwise, they tend to be pretty blue. Again, we also talked about the inherent problems, the battleground issues, the wrong winner system, where you can have a huge disparity between the popular vote winner and the winner of the Electoral College. There have been a number of studies there, including from some of the opponents of National Popular Vote Compact, that basically show that you can win the Electoral College with a very small percentage of the vote. That has not happened, but with an extra candidate or very tight races in a number of states, it's theoretically possible to win in only about in double digits of 16%, 15%. That's very unlikely, but that's certainly not democracy. So in terms of the battleground states, here is the real chart from 2016. I think this year with Zoom things, I don't know what this map will look like. In the previous elections, 2012, 2008, all the way to 2000, these numbers were even more concentrated than they were in the past. This is a little more spread out, but as you can see, most states are really ignored in this process, and it doesn't matter whether you're large or small. It's only if a candidate can win or not win, and that's a function of the state laws and the winner take all rules, because it just doesn't make sense to visit a state where you're hopelessly behind or further ahead and you can't possibly lose. So how would a national popular vote interstate compact work? It is legislation that uses 2 parts of the US Constitution. The first, giving the states the authority to determine how to award their electors. Again, election is not required and was not conducted in many elections in this country, admittedly, most of them in the 1800s. But, but that authority, along with the interstate contracts clause, means that states can enter into contracts with each other, also called interstate compacts. Those compacts, there's literally thousands plus of them across the country. They are legally enforceable. And the way that the plan works is that the states who join pass identical enabling legislation. And that legislation says simply that they will agree to give all of their electors in their state to the winner of the national popular vote in all 50 states, not just in the compacting states, not just in their own state, but in all 50 states, provided that a majority of the Electoral College joins on at the same time. The effect of the compact is virtually identical to a constitutional amendment, but it retains the power to control the presidential elections in states' hands. For many Democrats, that is not something that they particularly care about, but we actually do have some passionate bipartisan support, even in this day. Michael Steele, RNC, from the RNC, and Saul Anuzis, a whole bunch of others, many ex-US senators who believe this is the right way to go. But for the conservative endorsers for the National Popular Vote Compact, this is a critical feature. It's not a deficit. I would also note that any changes in our Constitution that relate to voting rights, well, maybe not the lowering the voting age, but the right to vote for women, the direct election of senators in particular, those two are the ones I'm thinking about, started with state action. The direct election of senators, I think, is particularly on point. Before the amendment, states actually held elections for US senators, something called the Oregon Plan. And it wasn't until they came back basically to a majority of US senators actually being elected in an unofficial election, endorsed or ratified by their state legislatures, that they were ready to pass a constitutional amendment. So even if you think a constitutional amendment is the better way to go, this is the best way to start. So what are the benefits of a national popular vote? And ensure that the candidate with the most votes is elected. It would mean that every vote in every state would be equal and equally important. It would increase civic participation by giving states an incentive to voters in all states to participate. It would get rid of those really misleading red and blue election night maps. Our states aren't red and blue. They're actually very different shades of purple. And that is, I think it tends to magnify what we see as our divisions. It would ensure that candidates run campaigns in all 50 states and pay attention to the concerns of all voters, regardless of which state they live in. As we also mentioned, we may see some policy impacts because of the need to pander to certain Rust Belt states and others, and states like California, who have a big share of the population, are really left out of that. It would also create less opportunities, we believe, for fraud and manipulation. Not that this is a big deal, but if you can suppress a certain number of votes, a very small number, you can leverage a high percentage of electoral votes. Think Florida 2000. A 500 vote margin got the winner 10% of the amount nationwide needed to win. A tremendous number for a very small number of votes. With a huge millions of votes that separate, it's very difficult to change those numbers. So what states have passed national popular vote? This is a list. The blue ones are the states that have passed and enacted them into law. The pink ones are ones that have passed one chamber or two chambers, but not actually enacted. It did pass Nevada, and we did get a gubernatorial veto. But we also have some red state chambers that have passed it, and some committees in red states that have passed it. I don't know, how this all will play out after this current election, but we will see. So the threshold for national popular vote going into effect is 200 and states representing 270 electors. And out of that, we currently have 196. So 15 states have passed, and we still need 74 electoral votes to go. So about 3/4 of the way there, which is pretty good. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we can have a little bit more conversation. So somebody had asked, there's just a few more details I think is relevant, because when I was asked to participate, they said, is it too late to get it for this election? Well, I don't think anybody would probably ask that question, but it was too late as of July 1st. Because the compact says you cannot join or withdraw from the beginning of July through Inauguration Day. Actually, it's the end of July, but it's a 6-month period. And that's a standard clause in many of these compacts that courts have upheld. They've deemed them ineffective, so they just count it as if they were participating. Is this going to have litigation? Absolutely. There's no question that the legality of this compact will be litigated. And there's a provision in it to actually draw that litigation. When the final state goes on, there's a little notice sent to every attorney general in the country. Not that they probably don't read the newspaper and won't know, but the idea is kind of to poke them and to get them to try to block it. And so there's a lot. Everybody, when they're thinking about this, have many, many questions. And there are great answers to all of those. There's a website. I put our website in the chat, but there's also www.nationalpopularvote.com. That's sort of a little library, including a book you can get for free that covers all of the questions and all of the details. It's very well researched. And I look forward to taking your questions later on.
Thank you, Pam. You provided a perfect segue to Ronnie Pawelko, and that is with your assurance that we're going to get litigation. And I think you're absolutely right. Of course, the Ronnie Pawelko is the senior counsel for the Boulder Advocacy Program at Alliance for Justice, and who is based in the Washington, D.C. office. She provides through training and technical assistance to nonprofit organizations and foundations with accessible information, resources, and information, so organizations can safely navigate complex laws and rules as they pursue systems changes. She received her JD from Albany Law School and her BA from Russell Sage College. Before joining the Alliance for Justice, she was the general counsel at Family Planning Advocates of New York State. She also served as Health and Human Services team counsel for the New York State Senate and as staff attorney for the Merger Watch Project. Ronnie hopefully will address what organizations such as CWI, which is a 501c3, can do or cannot do, particularly as this litigation, as Pam has pointed us to, over the national compact. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ronnie. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So there will definitely be litigation. I'm almost certainly there's been just huge amounts of litigation already. I think there's been at least 60 lawsuits filed over various processes such as when to count absentee ballots, which ballots get counted, whether or not a state legislature gets to make the decision, whether or not courts can overrule it. I think everyone has I've certainly watched the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett last night. She is actually going to potentially be a huge factor, particularly in Pennsylvania and decisions about which ballots get counted. And so before we even get to the Electoral College actually casting their votes, there's a couple of key timeframes where a lot of, I'll just say mischief can happen about whether or not voters have their ballots counted. So on December 1st, secretaries of state certify their state's election results. And then on December 8th, the governors of every state must certify those results. In these timeframes, there can be enormous amounts of issues that come up, particularly with the absentee ballots. You know, the usual things that we've all heard of. As you can see, I was from New York, and so New York is certainly no stranger to litigation over absentee ballots. So things like in Pennsylvania, we're going to come up with whether or not we can revisit that Supreme Court decision that allowed ballots to be counted 3 days later. We're going to be litigating over whether or not signatures match, whether or not there's stray marks. So there's going to be a huge range, and also whether or not the governor or secretaries of state are certifying their election results prematurely in ways that do not reflect the will of the voters. So all of this stuff can happen before we even get to figure out who the electors are, because there certainly can be efforts to make sure that the electors that are chosen are in favor of one candidate over the other. And this is probably going to be important because there is some information that's tracking how people are already voting in the early voting states. We know that right now, more Democratic voters have returned absentee ballots than Republican voters. With early in-person voting, more Republicans have voted in in-person voting as opposed to Democratic ones. And so one of the issues that Donald Trump has talked about, and listen to what people are saying to see what we may hear, is that he is indicating that if early election results on election night indicate a Republican win, that any later results that flip the results to the Democratic side are suspect and potentially fraudulent. So I think we're going to see litigation over whether or not there is something fraudulent. We've seen the Indiana Attorney General tweeting about this very same issue about needing to get the election results in one day. So I think the fact that we have so many absentee ballots, and in many states, they cannot start counting the ballots until after election day, there's certainly going to be some delayed results. And during that time frame, there is going to be efforts to not count some ballots or call into question whether or not it's fraudulent. And then when we do get to the electors, there's the issues of whether or not state legislatures could try to replace those electors. And then in many states, electors actually do not have to follow what the voters have done. So there's all of these potential issues that come up with the electors. So there's certainly at every step of the way, huge opportunities for nonprofits to get involved. And what they can do and how they can do it definitely does matter on their tax status. So C4s are, I'll start with them just because in some ways they're the easiest. So C4s are social welfare organizations, meaning their primary purpose has to be something that benefits the community as a whole. Basically everything a C3 can do. But they are allowed to do partisan work. And when it comes to federal races, they actually can support or oppose candidates. So they can actually be engaging in advocacy that is aimed at supporting one of the candidates. And I am sure that we're going to be seeing this. They can make independent expenditures, that is happening already, but they can also post-election target some of their activities in a partisan way to encourage and support one particular candidate. C3s can actually do a lot of similar things, but they need to frame it in different ways. So if you are engaging in advocacy that is aimed at voters, making sure all valid ballots are counted, that is nonpartisan. Now, I think you need to be cautious in where you're targeting your efforts and what language you're using, but C3s can get involved in that. So C3s are, of course, not, they must remain nonpartisan, meaning all of their advocacy cannot be supporting the election or defeat of any candidate. I think there's often an open question of when does someone stop being a candidate? And I think this interim period before we actually do have the Electoral College voting, in some ways, people may still be considered candidates. So a C3 cannot be going out there and making sure they're, advocating for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump. That would be impermissible. But there's going to be a lot of permissible advocacy that C3s are going to be able to take part in. So administrative advocacy is not lobbying. So that's also important because C3s are limited in how much lobbying they may do. And at this time of year, some of them may have actually bumped up against their lobbying limits. But they certainly can engage in advocacy around the Secretary of State certification and the process of counting ballots. And this ballot counting process is going to be really important, that all valid ballots are counted. I mean, we can't be having situations where voters have their vote canceled because, for example, they had a stray mark on their ballot or their signature doesn't exactly match. I think that is something that is going to be happening. C3s definitely can get out there and encourage their Secretary of State to count all valid ballots. And that's not partisan because this is all about making sure the voters' will is adhered to. If it goes one way or the other, then so be it, as long as all valid ballots are counted. So there's also going to be an opportunity to do ballot chasing. So ballot chasing right now, we know there are millions of absentee ballots out there that have not been turned in yet. C3s definitely can, at this point, before the election is over, encourage people in a nonpartisan way that they get out and they cast their vote. I know right now people are really concerned because of the shenanigans with the post office that it is probably getting too late to try to mail your ballot. And so C3s can be encouraging and helping voters get their ballots to any ballot drop-off boxes or to their voting districts. Every state is different, so whatever happens has to comply with state law, and it has to be, I would say, in strict compliance, because that's something that we are seeing in the litigation is at least on the federal level, courts seem to be calling for strict compliance with the laws. So, to the letter, no leeway. If it's, because of COVID, their Supreme Court has not allowed any kind of variance on state laws based on protecting people's health. So everything has to be done in strict compliance with the law. But C3s can get involved in that. In some states, you are able to track your absentee ballot and see whether or not it has been accepted. North Carolina is one of those states where a lot of the absentee ballots have been rejected because of not being in strict compliance with their state laws. But voters are given the opportunity to cure their ballot in North Carolina. So a C3 actually could encourage and inform voters how they can cure their ballots in a nonpartisan way. So that's definitely an opportunity depending on where your C3 is located and what your state law allows. Litigation is certainly going to be happening. C3s can get involved in litigation, once again, in a way that is encouraging whoever is in the process of counting the votes to make sure that all valid ballots are counted and that state, federal, and constitutional laws are followed. In fact, in the Bush v. Gore case, the Brennan Center filed an amicus brief to ensure that proper laws were followed and that valid votes were counted. So that was completely permissible for a 501c3. So Well, engaging in your own litigation is not something a lot of C3s are able to engage in on their own. They can certainly join amicus briefs and raise their voices. They can add a paragraph about the communities they represent. And provided your focus of that litigation is following the law and making sure the voter's will is adhered to, that is a permissible 501c3 activity. It's even possible to do some direct advocacy and lobbying. It's probably not likely, but there still is a potential to change state laws through emergency legislative sessions. I think maybe that's my advocate fantasy, that some state laws actually will meet to extend the time frame for receiving absentee ballots. Highly unlikely, but we can all wish. That would actually be permissible for a 501c3 to do. So it would be kind of interesting. And I think that there's a few potential avenues in states to even set up a conflict of laws across different jurisdictions. And then finally, we know there's going to be protests. As people remember in Bush before, in Florida, one of the things that happened while they were trying to figure out what to do with the famous hanging chads was there was what we called the Brooks Brothers riot, where Republican operatives caused such a ruckus that they prevented ballots from counting, which was really instrumental because eventually when it got to the Supreme Court essentially said we're out of time. And so we know that there is going to be protests, encouraging people to ensure the voters' will is counted, that we don't have these shenanigans where partisan operatives are really trying to interfere with the will of the voters, trying to claim fraud. It is completely permissible for 501c3s to engage in protest. Protest is a First Amendment protected activity. There's certainly, areas where there may be illegal activity going on, and that's where C3 should be cautious because C3s cannot promote illegal activity. And that I'm not going to get too far into that because that gets to be a really complicated legal subject, but certainly C3s can encourage their supporters to join protests. They can sponsor a protest. They can go stand in front of the Board of Elections and say, count every vote. And that is completely permissible. So I think that there's huge ranges of activities that C3s can do. I'd say the most important thing right now is to continue talking to voters to let them know that if there is a delay in election results because we have so many absentee ballots, that this is not a sign of fraud. This is just a sign of the process working, and it may take time. And to push back against calls that we have a failed election or a fraudulent election because it takes people time to accurately count ballots. And we can also encourage people to get out and vote. And C3s can definitely encourage people to make sure they vote in a way that ensures their vote is counted. If we have a huge turnout where in some of these swing states that Pam talked about, the key states, if we have a clear election night victory, there is going to be a lot less potential for some of this mischief that we are all concerned about seeing happen. So I think we do have on our Boulder Advocacy website a blog. I put a link on that. Basically covers what I just said about all the potential avenues for what 501c3s can do. We mostly focus on C3s just because they have the most restrictions on what they can do. And we will be continuing to blog about current events because we really don't know what's going to happen. We are just laying out all the scenarios that we think are possible. But we will be blogging about what's going on and what C3s may and may not do. So go to boulderadvocacy.org and click on our blog link or follow us on Twitter, and we will have resources that are timely and up to date. And you can always call us. We have a technical assistance hotline. We always have attorneys on call. We are double staffing so we can help handle potentially a deluge of calls. With one caveat, because I'm a lawyer, I come with a disclaimer, and that's we can't serve as your counsel and we can't offer legal advice, but we can help you understand the laws and what you may do as a 501c3. We do sometimes say you need an attorney. So, but reach out to us and check out our resources, because we certainly encourage all C3s to get involved in protecting democracy and being part of democracy and creating change. So I will close with that and open it up to conversation.
Yes, thank you very much, Ronnie, and thank you, Pam and Geraldo. I'm going to turn this over to Connie Cordovilla, our co-president, who has the capacity to organize our Q&A session. Connie, go ahead.
Okay, between Sherry and I think we can do it. Sherry, do you have any questions in the chat?
I don't see any.
Okay, all right. I'm opening it up. Mary Pollock, I see your hand up. Unmute yourself, my dear.
I put in chat, explain this December 1st, December 8th time frame, the calendar. We're going to go through with the calendar on the Electoral College. Maybe Geraldo, or I don't know who can answer that best.
And Gerardo, you probably know this better than I do, because I'm the advocate, not the professor. And you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'll take a stab at it. So just stepping back to the kind of the messy framework of the Electoral College that I was describing in my talk. One piece that I left out of the puzzle, I told you about the constitutional provision that empowers legislatures. And I talked about state law, and the National Popular Vote Compact would be a creature of state law. One thing that I left out of that story is a federal law from 1887 called the Electoral Count Act. And it was passed in the wake of one of those, what I called wayward elections, the 1876 election, designed to bring some order and stability to the electoral vote process. That law is, I don't know, before the official talk started, somebody was joking about a scenario where Nancy Pelosi becomes president and Mike Pence is vice president. And that's a sort of arcane corner of the possibilities contemplated by that law. But the key thing about it, for your question, Mary, is that it sets December 14th as the date when the electors meet in their states to cast their votes. And it also sets January 6th as the date when the vice president, Mike Pence, as president of the Senate, will preside over a joint session of the new House and Senate, the ones that come in a couple days before that, to count the electoral votes. That's all set up by federal law. Now, the federal law also sets up, prior to December 14th, I think 6 days before, on December 8th, something called the safe harbor deadline. And this is getting into some of the more arcane corners of it, but state results that are certified by the safe harbor deadline are in some ways protected against certain challenges when it comes to the vote count on January 6th. So those are the sort of the key dates set by federal law. At the state level, certification is going to vary, I think, state to state, and there's many layers of it. Like a local election official at the county level has to certify results by a certain day and send them to the chief election officer of the state. In most states, that's the Secretary of State, who then does their own certification and declares one slate of electors as the winner. And then that would be the slate that meets on December 14th. So those are sort of the key dates to keep in mind. The local and state certifications happen according to state law, but they have to happen ideally before that safe harbor deadline of December 8th. And then December 14th this year is the day when the electors are supposed to meet in their different states. What's funny about all of this is that the Electoral Count Act is meant to be practical. It was passed because we had a very divisive election in 1876. perhaps the most divisive election we've ever had. But it also has become a kind of like ceremony. And it is the main federal law that would be looked to if things got really bizarre. And the interpretation of it in many respects is unclear, and it's a kind of untested part of our system. I want to cede the floor to the other speakers because they may have some other insights into that process. But the key fact for making sense of those deadlines is that law, the Electoral Count Act.
Yeah, the only thing I would say on that is that a couple of things that come up and relate to all of what we talked about. Gerardo mentioned that electors are in slates, and those are picked by the parties themselves. So most of you are aware of the decision striking down the Colorado and another one, or a decision about the Colorado Faithless Elector Act. And the impact of that is actually much less significant than a lot of people think, because the way that electors are selected and the ways that parties do that typically are your very, your top donors as a party, your state committee members, people who are have no incentive to vote for someone other than the party's choice. And because of the Electoral Act sets the date of the election, and the Constitution gives the Congress the ability to do that, sort of changing laws after the fact are, I think, gonna be not permissible. But this law has one huge hole, and that is declaring a failed election. It doesn't say what a failed election is. Historically, it related to not holding a runoff. But who gets to do that? How does it work? Under what circumstances? And that is very much going to be an area that needs to be fixed if we don't see it. But it's also the area where we'll see a lot of potential mischief if things go down as we fear they might.
Right. Well, and that's also why the outcome of the House and Senate races matter also, because it is the new Congress that gets to, that odd scenario of Nancy Pelosi as president would be an ultimate failed election with, with a few more houses in the states flipping to the Democrats, because if we have a failed election, the Senate or the House gets to pick the president, but the votes are based on state. It isn't the whole 435 people that vote. So because right now there is a majority of democratically controlled states, Republican controlled states, it would be the Republicans who pick the president under the current House of Representatives. So it's all like incredibly wonky and fun to imagine, but we may actually be playing the reality. And I think none of us really know what is going to happen. And that's why there's so much scenario going on. And I think it's why Older Advocacy will be blogging about what you can do based on whatever is happening, but the broad principles of C3s being able to encourage all valid votes to be counted holds, and whatever is going on is still going to be permissible. So it's it could be a wild scene. We really we don't know.
Yeah, and just just stepping back for a moment, I have to admit I'm sort of torn. In general, I think our system has a lot of safeguards built in, and the very kind of bizarre scenarios we're discussing are highly unlikely. They're of great academic interest, and so I want to talk about them because they're kind of cool. But I also don't want the participants in the call to, I don't know. I'm curious how Pam and Ronnie feel about this, but I'm generally quite confident in the institutions that we have, but I'm also aware that there are untested safeguards, you know, and the exploration of them is a very interesting intellectual question. I don't think it's a, you know, something that we need to be panicking about, but I also think it's something that needs reform, you know. So just, you know, to be frank, it's kind of hard to know how to balance, you know, those ideas right now.
So one thing I would say is, I put in the chat, the most legislatures have adjourned sine die, which I'm not, you guys, I'm sure someone's there is Latin, but which means it's very difficult to get them back. So declaring a failed election or appointing another electors by the legislature is going to be exceedingly difficult in most states. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania is in session right now, and so is Michigan. But you know, some of the other states that folks are concerned about, it's going to be very difficult for them to come back, if not impossible. So we're looking at a small universe. There are there's litigation conversations going on to prepare for all these different eventualities. There's on the ground efforts. But I do, and we are cautioning, as Gerardo said, about taking too alarmist an approach. We want people to vote. We want them to be confident in our institutions. And both sides are sort of ratcheting up the pressure in a way, and we want to try to tamp it down, and to talk about the way our institutions work as opposed to how they could fail, because that just gets, I mean, it's fine for us to game it out and think about it, but in our public messaging, we are not, there's a group called Protect the Results. They're just going to be doing a set of rallies. We had initially talked with them. We've asked them to remove our name since just because it's just too soon to have, we think, to talk about that and to have a big rally the day after the election.
Right.
Unless something bad happens. And when something bad happens, we're all in. But it's kind of just premature. You know, let's be ready, but let's not execute until there's something to execute on and not be the other side.
Agreed. And if our hosts wanted to reconvene us in a more uncertain scenario post-election, you know, that, you know, we could do that. But I think, right, the most important things to talk about right now are the sort of structure that we have. And it is interesting. One of the points you mentioned, Pam, in your talk was that a funny thing that the Electoral College does is it distorts at the margins, you know, something like the felon vote in Florida this year, or the you know, the 500 vote margin in 2000 can have this tremendous effect. One problem with that is that in a polarized time right now, it makes it seem like every little fight in the battleground states is a life or death matter for the opposing parties, and it really ups the tension nationally in a terrible way. And at the same time, it has this effect of possibly suppressing voter turnout and enthusiasm in the non-battleground states. So the Electoral College, the way it's set up, it's kind of giving us a lot of anxiety as a nation, and that may be one of the best reasons to to reform it in the ways that you've talked about.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I think I am a little concerned about Pennsylvania being a swing state and the potential for litigation going to the Supreme Court, but and ballots not being counted because of mail delays. I think that's a concern. But what is also fascinating is to see the huge voter interest. And as a longtime advocate, I think that this is really great for our democracy, that so many people are paying attention and so many people are voting. And regardless of who they're voting for, I think that there is, I think ultimately, I know we've been focusing a lot on our divisions the last few months, but when you really look at polling and what people care about, people do care about fairness. And so I think that fair elections, certainly regardless of who is elected, is still something we can keep on talking about. people care about healthcare. I think this is why the Supreme Court battle was so much about healthcare and why the Republicans are so defensive about their vote and how they're going to protect people with pre-existing conditions. So there's definitely a lot that we agree on and a lot of advocacy that people are still going to be doing, regardless of who is elected. The need to be getting involved in policy isn't going away, including, a more fair and maybe a less stressful election process. So I always like to see the bright side also. And so people paying attention to the Electoral College may actually bring about some change that we could all agree with.
Are there any other questions out there? Okay, Holly, unmute yourself.
I just looked up who our electors are. I live in Maryland, and I'm totally confused because I don't think it really answered. It said possible electors. And so how do the electors in a state get chosen?
That's what I was just talking about. So currently it is the electors are the ones that will meet on December 14th. And the slate gets selected is the one that wins that state by the laws of that state. And 48 of them, it's the winner take all version. And then, as I mentioned, you might have two slates actually meeting in a state like Nebraska, and but they only get a smaller number of votes. But the parties that select those electors are doing it either with no process whatsoever. So the party chairman gets to handpick them. Sometimes the state committee of the party does it, again, not in a public way. And a few of the state parties have a convention process where they're selected at their state conventions. I think those state convention things will go away very soon if they haven't already gone away. But it's really up to those state parties to do it, and it's not a subject of state law.
I've just never heard of, I've only heard of one of the potential electors in my own state. Isn't that?
Well, that's not surprising because they would be donors to the party, people that are, they're party loyalists. That's who they are.
But
Yeah.
wouldn't you think we all might have a say on that? No?
Well, one interesting thing, it doesn't fully address Holly's question, but the Constitution has a limitation on who can be an elector. You can't hold certain offices. So it's designed not to be politicians. Now, what that ends up meaning in a time like the present, as Pam was saying, is that like donors and the like become electors because of their influence. But I think the vision of the framers on this was that outstanding non-politician citizens would be those people. That doesn't really address your concern, which I think is a very valid one. Like, it would be nice to have some democratic say, but I think because their role is so constrained once they're selected, I'm not sure what difference it makes. If the Electoral College had been what had been originally envisioned, which was really a deliberative process where the electors met in their states and debated, then the identities of the individuals might.
It's purely a ceremonial function. They have no role. They're just a rubber stamp of the party's choice in that state. And they really don't do anything. They dress up and often, at least in my state, they dress up in ball gowns and tuxedos and nice suits and go have some champagne. And it's just like a little party. They just get to voice their thing. It's just, no one covers it in the news. It's not a real thing. It's just a rubber stamp. And under the National Popular Vote program, it would be the same. This is the first time we've paid any attention to any of these dates and that I can remember.
Well, yeah. In 2000, it was interesting because when Bush v. Gore went to the Supreme Court, they issued a stay that effectively blocked the counting of votes in Florida for a little while. And the safe harbor deadline that year really mattered because the stay kind of made it impossible to count the votes in time for that. So yeah, but generally, you know, you're right. Like that's the funny thing about the Electoral Count Act is that it sets up these procedures that have largely just been a matter of ceremony. Like that count that happens in Congress where the vice president presides has just been a formality. And in some ways, there have been some very funny moments where Al Gore in 2000 was the vice president presiding over the count of the electoral votes for George W. Bush. Yeah. And, you know, but it could matter.
Okay, we have a question. What are the probabilities of rogue or faithless electors this time around? Anyone want to cast a guess?
I'll just say again, I think they're very low. You know, they have never really played a big role. There's as we've just talked about their selection process. That means that they're not going to go rogue because these are the hand-picked people of the party leadership. And, you know, there have been a handful over time. There are some states that had these statutes requiring them and to having, you know, penalties for not going along with their party's role. But those were mostly superfluous and it only applied to half the states. And some of those states had looser selection processes because it wasn't necessary to keep them on the inside. But like my state of Massachusetts never had one of those statutes. And so, and we've never had a faithless elector. I just don't see it as a big issue.
Yeah, the cases that you may have heard about, the Supreme Court decided 2 cases together, one from Washington and one from Colorado this year about faithless electors in 2016. That, or rogue electors as Mindy asked, those happened under a very peculiar circumstance where electors that were pledged to Hillary Clinton voted for other Republicans, Colin Powell, I think, and John Kasich, hoping to start like a kind of mini revolt among the Republican electors, but it didn't happen. And it's very unlikely in a normal election that a rogue elector would vote for somebody other than the candidate of their party. That's part of this election process.
Okay, thank you. Jeanette, you had your hand up and then we have a question in the, couple of questions in the box.
Yes, I have a question probably for Ronnie. You mentioned that North Carolina allows a curing of a ballot that is considered not countable because of various reasons, maybe a signature. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. What is the time frame and how does that process work in North Carolina?
So I'm not entirely sure how it works, but I'm sure that the time frame is governed by state law. I'm not sure if they have any time after the election day to cure their ballot, but I'm assuming, you know, the voter can, if it's the signature, they can verify their signature probably, or perhaps they have an opportunity to vote in person and discard their ballot. All I know is that the law exists and that it is a potential. And I do know that it just, in some districts, there's been a high number of returned ballots. And it possibly could be because of new voters not strictly following the instructions.
Is that typical? Do most states have a process for curing a ballot that is considered not countable?
It varies by state. I know I'm from New York and you don't even know if your ballot's been returned. So you have no opportunity. And that's one of the things we have, you know, essentially 51 different election systems.
Right.
Counting DC. And so I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's incredibly typical though.
Okay, I have a question from Linda Jefferson. If it's only ceremonial, then how does their vote outweigh the popular vote? Maybe this question was asked earlier. In other words, if the role of the electors is ceremonial, and I think that's pretty much determined by what if I understood what the conversation has been, by what the popular vote in the state was, and that pretty much precludes how the electors are going to be forced to vote, or not forced, maybe that's not the right word, but how their vote will go.
I may have been the person, I don't know who first used the word ceremonial. And if I did introduce it, or was you? Okay, yeah. I'll just say that when I used it, my thought was that not to say that it lacks legal effect or anything like that, but that those deadlines in the Electoral Count Act have, and the joint session of Congress on January 6th have often been, though legally very significant, they have not been contested in any meaningful way. And so that's what I meant by ceremony, not to suggest that they weren't effectual. What is a slim but real possibility is that that meeting of Congress on January 6th may be more contentious this year, and then that's the sense of not ceremonial that I
Mhm.
Mary Pollock also posed another scenario, and that is if Trump loses, and because he's facing so many federal lawsuits, he resigns the presidency before January 20th so that Pence can exonerate him in a presidential pardon. In that case, who presides over the January 6th joint session of Congress? And I'm thinking it's Mitch McConnell, but I could be wrong. Or is it Nancy?
No, I think presumably Pence could appoint a vice president. We don't really have a process for this, but in the past, that's what's happened. So I guess that's what Pence would appoint someone. We could all guess who that might be.
I hesitate to think. Yeah. And then, of course, it could all end up in the Supreme Court. And then it's going to be a toss-up. So we think. Or maybe, no, I'm being hopeful for that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I'm looking for raised hands.
How would adding DC impact the Electoral College? Well, DC already has 3 votes. And so you get, I don't know if it would change it. I don't know if we would get more than 1 representative. Would we get 2? Does anyone know that?
Yeah, so the 23rd Amendment gave the District of Columbia 3 electoral votes. And I believe, when I check the language on this, that it limits DC's electoral vote representation to that of the smallest state. So that if DC were a state, it would be freed from that restriction and could potentially acquire a 4th or a 5th, or, I don't know how populous it could get. So that's but it makes that very small difference, and I'm not sure. I think that if DC were admitted as a state right now, it would still have 3, but it could potentially grow its representation in the college.
Are there any other questions? Jeanette, I'm going to leave it to you to summate everything.
Yes, I am full of both questions and answers from our 3 speakers. It was wonderful hearing from each of you. It was like a seminar in constitutional law, electoral college, an update on our current situation. It was very invigorating. We may take you up on reconvening you afterwards. And
You offered.
Yes, it's a wonderful, wonderful offer. And if anybody on this call has not voted yet, please go out and vote and help others to vote. And Common Cause, continue your work on making every vote count. And thanks again. I think we're all much improved in knowledge and understanding of what's going to happen, not only in the next 7 days, but quite a lot beyond. Thank you.
And if I might put in a plug for Brennan Center event, if anybody is interested in an Electoral College doubleheader today, on the Brennan Center website, you might see that at 5:30 we are having an online event, because it's possible that this raised questions that are then going to percolate, or you do some more reading after lunch. We'll be having an online event about the Electoral College tonight at 5:30, and you can still register for that on the Brennan Center site. So it's another opportunity to dive deeper into these questions.
And remind everybody about our November 17th meeting. That's Tuesday, the November 17th at noon. It's going to be on post-election priorities for women's issues. And we hope that they're very bright.
Let's hope.
All right. Well, I thank everyone for making this a very enjoyable and educational event, and look forward to hearing more about it. Recording of the event, and we will have a summary of it in the newsletter, which we'll be happy to send to anyone who's on our list. So thank you so much.